Sometimes survival demands you trust a stranger more than the family who raised you. Hello, lovely reader. If you're finding pleasure in this tale of history and heart, would you consider leaving a like or subscribing? Your support helps me continue crafting stories of passion, peril, and the past. And do share in the comments where you're reading from. I treasure every word, and it never fails to warm my heart. St. Michael's Church, Hampshire, England. Spring morning, 1827. The vestibule of St. Michael's Church smelled of beeswax and lilies, but all Francesca could taste was copper, the metallic tang of fear coating her tongue. Beyond the ancient oak doors, 200 guests waited in rustling silence. Any moment now, the organ would thunder to life, and she would be expected to walk toward a fate worse than death itself. The wedding dress was exquisite torture. Layers of ivory, silk, and Valenciennes lace crushed her ribs beneath a corset laced so tightly she could barely draw breath. The modist had called it a triumph. Francesca called it a prison she could not escape. "Miss Francesca," Rose's whisper cut through her spiraling thoughts. Her lady's maid, her only true friend since childhood, materialized beside her, face pale as chalk. In Rose's trembling hands lay a letter, its wax seal already broken. "You must read this, now." Rose pressed it into Francesca's gloved fingers. "I intercepted it from Mr. Jenkins's chambers this morning." "Rose, I cannot. The ceremony begins in minutes." "Read it." The urgency in Rose's voice made Francesca's hands shake as she unfolded the paper. The handwriting was masculine, efficient, belonging to someone who valued time above sentiment. Jenkins. Confirmation received from Dr. Blackwood at Ashworth Asylum. Private wing prepared per our arrangement. Once inheritance transfers at marriage, committal papers will be processed under diagnosis of female hysteria. Standard procedure requires only husband's signature. No family consent necessary under law. After 6 months confinement, you may dispose of her as you see fit. My fee remains £5,000, half on admittance, balance upon permanent resolution. Destroy this correspondence. Dr. Edmund Graves. The vestibule tilted. Francesca gripped the wooden pew beside her, splinters catching on her silk gloves. "There's more," Rose whispered, producing a second document. "I found this in your uncle's study. It's a financial ledger." The numbers swam before Francesca's eyes, but certain figures leapt out with terrible clarity. Gambling debts, Whitmore Club, £42,000. Creditors demanding payment by June 1st. Total estate value upon Francesca's marriage, £50,000. £50,000. The inheritance from her parents' shipping company, held in trust until her 25th birthday, or until marriage when it would pass to her husband's control. The memory crashed over her, like the wave that had claimed her parents 12 years ago. She'd been 15 when the storm struck off Portsmouth. One moment, Mother had been laughing at Father's terrible attempt at a sea shanty. The next, the world had shattered into screaming wind and salt water. Francesca had clung to wreckage for hours, screaming their names until her voice died, until the fishing boat found her at dawn. Uncle Reginald had arrived at her bedside with dry eyes and a solicitor. "Your parents' estate is substantial," he'd said, adjusting his cufflinks. "I shall manage it until you come of age, or marry, naturally." She should have known, should have questioned why he'd pushed this match so insistently, why he'd dismissed every suitor who'd courted her naturally and presented Mr. Gerald Jenkins, a widower of 43 with eyes like winter stones, as her only viable option. His first wife, Francesca heard herself say. "Rose, how did she die?" Rose's silence was answer enough. The organ's first note sounded a deep, resonant command that vibrated through the floorboards. The wedding march, her execution song. "The Duke of Ravenwood's carriage," Rose said urgently, gripping Francesca's shoulders. "It's in the square, the one with the raven crest. I saw his footman leave it unlocked while he stepped into the tavern. The Duke's bound for his estate in Kent. You're suggesting I—" Francesca couldn't finish the thought. It was madness. "I'm suggesting you survive." Rose's eyes blazed with fierce devotion. "That letter means Mr. Jenkins intends to lock you away the moment you speak your vows. 6 months in an asylum, then." She swallowed hard. Miss Francesca, his first wife, went to Ashworth too. She never came home. The organ swelled. Through the doors, she heard the shuffle of guests rising to their feet. Francesca looked down at herself, at the orange blossoms woven through her hair, their sickeningly sweet perfume now the scent of her own grave. at the seed pearls encrusting her bodice, each one a tiny weight dragging her toward doom. At her hands, pale and shaking in their kid-leather gloves. She'd always been obedient, proper, the perfect ward, never questioning Uncle Reginald's decisions, even when something in Jenkins's smile, in the way his gaze moved over her like she was inventory to be catalogued, made her stomach clench. She'd dismissed her own instincts, told herself she was being foolish, dramatic, that marriage was duty, not romance, that her discomfort was simply maiden nerves. How many women had made the same fatal mistake? The vestibule door handle began to turn Uncle Reginald, coming to escort her down the aisle. Francesca grabbed Rose's hand. "Come with me, Miss Francesca. Please." Rose's face crumpled with relief. The side door. Now. They ran. The heavy skirts threatened to trip her with every step, the corset crushing her lungs. But Francesca didn't stop. Behind them, she heard Uncle Reginald's shout of alarm, the sudden confused murmur of guests. Spring sunlight blinded her as they burst into the square. There the carriage, with its raven crest, glossy black lacquer gleaming like a dark promise. Rose wrenched the door open. Francesca gathered her skirts in desperate fistfuls and climbed inside, Rose scrambling after her. The interior smelled of leather and tobacco and something else, something wild, like wind across moors. "Go!" Rose shouted to the coachman, who'd appeared looking bewildered. "Medical emergency. The lady needs a physician in Kent." Whether he believed it or was simply startled into obedience, the coachman climbed onto his bench. The carriage lurched forward. Through the window, Francesca saw Uncle Reginald burst from the church, his face purple with rage. Gerald Jenkins appeared beside him, and for one terrible moment their eyes met across the square. His expression wasn't shock or hurt. It was cold, calculated fury, the look of a man whose investment had just escaped. Then the carriage turned the corner, and St. Michael's Church disappeared from view. Francesca pressed her hand to her corseted ribs, feeling her heart slam against whalebone stays. What had she done? She'd just climbed into a stranger's carriage wearing a wedding dress worth more than most families earned in a year, with no plan beyond escape and no idea who might be waiting at journey's end. Sometimes survival demands you trust a stranger more than the family who raised you. She could only pray she'd chosen correctly. The carriage wheels clattered over cobblestones, each rotation carrying Francesca farther from the only life she'd ever known. Rose clutched her hand so tightly their fingers ached, but neither woman spoke. What was there to say? They'd just fled Francesca's own wedding, stolen a duke's carriage, and were now hurtling toward what, exactly? Kent. Rose had said the duke was bound for Kent. That was all they knew. Through the window, Hampshire's green countryside blurred past. Church spires and thatched cottages gave way to rolling hills dotted with sheep. The spring morning remained achingly beautiful, indifferent to Francesca's shattered world. "Miss Francesca," Rose's voice trembled. "What do we do when we arrive?" Francesca opened her mouth, but no answer came. She'd acted on pure instinct, the animal terror of prey scenting the trap. Now that terror was ebbing, replaced by the cold reality of her situation. No money, no clothes save this suffocating wedding dress, no plan whatsoever beyond escape. She thought of the letter still clutched in her hand. "After 6 months' confinement, you may dispose of her as you see fit." Dispose. As though she was spoiled meat to be discarded. Jenkins's first wife had gone to Ashworth Asylum. She'd never come home. Francesca pressed her free hand against her stomach, fighting nausea. How long had that poor woman lasted? Had she screamed for help? Begged to be believed when she insisted she wasn't mad? The asylum doctors wouldn't have listened. They never did. A husband's word was law, and female hysteria that convenient diagnosis could mean anything from genuine madness to simple defiance, to wanting control of one's own inheritance. "At least we're alive," Francesca whispered. "That's more than Jenkins intended." The carriage hit a rut. Both women gasped, gripping their seats as they were thrown sideways. When they righted themselves, Rose's face had gone ashen. "Miss Francesca, the coachman. When we arrive, he'll tell the Duke what we've done, that we commandeered his carriage under false pretenses." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "They could have us arrested for theft." The words landed like stones in Francesca's stomach. Of course. How had she not considered it? In her panic, she'd committed a crime they both had. And dukes had the power to see criminals prosecuted to the full extent of the law. But surely any reasonable man would understand. Once, she explained. Would he, though? She was the runaway bride of a respectable gentleman, making wild accusations about asylums and murder plots. She had no proof beyond a letter that Jenkins would claim was forged. Uncle Reginald would swear she'd gone mad with wedding day hysteria. Jenkins himself would appear the wronged party, jilted at the altar by an unstable woman. Who would believe her? A man she'd never met? Or the upstanding guardian who'd raised her for 12 years? The answer made her throat tighten. "We'll throw ourselves on his mercy," Francesca said, hearing the false confidence in her own voice. "We'll explain everything. Surely a duke has the power to help us somehow." Rose didn't look convinced, but she nodded. The landscape grew wilder as they traveled, Hampshire's gentle farmland giving way to Kent's ancient forests. Francesca watched gnarled oaks pass by, their branches still bare in early spring, like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. How appropriate. She felt equally stripped, vulnerable, exposed. Her thoughts drifted to the wedding dress she'd abandoned. Not abandoned, she was still wearing the wretched thing, corset crushing her ribs with each breath. But in her mind, she saw it as she'd left it. Pristine ivory silk pooled on stone floors, orange blossoms scattered like funeral flowers. What were the guests doing now? Uncle Reginald would have announced some excuse: bride taken ill, ceremony postponed. He couldn't admit she'd fled. The scandal would destroy him socially, ruin any chance of recouping his gambling losses. But eventually, the truth would emerge. And when it did, he and Jenkins would come looking for her. The thought made her shiver despite the warm carriage interior. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, then began its slow descent. Francesca's body ached from sitting, her stomach hollow with hunger. Neither she nor Rose had eaten since yesterday's supper. She'd been too nervous for breakfast. And then everything had happened so quickly. "We should have brought food," Rose muttered, voicing Francesca's own thoughts. "And money. And oh, Miss Francesca, we should have brought something besides ourselves." "We had 3 minutes to decide between safety and death," Francesca said quietly. "We chose correctly. But had they?" This carriage was carrying them toward an unknown man in an unfamiliar place. For all she knew, the Duke of Ravenwood could be worse than Jenkins. He could be cruel, or indifferent, or simply unwilling to involve himself in a stranger's troubles. The carriage began to slow. Francesca's heart lurched. Through the window, she glimpsed high stone walls, iron gates standing open. An estate, then. A grand one, judging by the length of the drive they were now traveling. Ancient trees lined the path, their branches forming a tunnel of shadow. Between them, Francesca caught glimpses of manicured lawns, marble fountains, a manor house in the distance that made her uncle's Hampshire estate look like a cottage. "We're here," Rose breathed. The carriage rolled to a stop. Francesca heard the coachman climb down, his boots crunching on gravel. Voices outside, male, authoritative, discussing something about the horses. Then footsteps approaching the carriage door. Francesca grabbed Rose's hand again. Her pulse thundered in her ears, so loud she was certain everyone in Kent must hear it. The door handle turned. Golden afternoon light flooded the interior. A footman stood there, livery immaculate, face professionally blank. His eyes swept over them, over Francesca's elaborate wedding dress and Rose's simpler traveling clothes, and something flickered in his expression. Surprise? Confusion? "His Grace," the footman said slowly, "was not expecting passengers." Before Francesca could formulate a response, another voice cut through the air, deep, cultured, carrying the weight of unquestioned authority. "Thomas, what's the delay?" The Duke of Ravenwood had arrived. Alexander Thorne, Duke of Ravenwood, knew something was wrong the moment his carriage rolled through the gates. It wasn't anything obvious, not to most men. But Alexander had spent 3 years learning to notice what others missed. It was how he'd stayed alive. He stood in the courtyard of Ravenwood Castle, watching his carriage approach. The ancient fortress rose behind him, all dark stone and Gothic spires clawing at the Kent sky. Home, though it had felt more like a tomb since the fire. "Your Grace," his steward, Morrison, bowed. "Welcome back. I trust your business in London concluded satisfactorily?" "Well enough." Alexander's eyes remained on the carriage. "Something's off." Morrison frowned. "Your Grace." The vehicle sat lower on its springs than it should. Not much, perhaps an inch. Most men wouldn't notice. But Alexander had spent months studying minute details, searching for the truth no one else wanted to see. An inch meant weight. Weight meant cargo he hadn't authorized. And then there was the scent. Orange blossoms. Faint but unmistakable, carried on the spring breeze. Wrong season entirely. Someone had been in his carriage wearing orange blossom perfume. His hand moved instinctively to his face, fingers tracing the network of scars that ran from temple to jaw. The fire had marked him inside and out. Society called him a recluse now, a gothic spectre haunting his own estate. They whispered about how the Duke of Ravenwood had lost his wife to flames 3 years ago and his sanity shortly after. Let them whisper. Alexander knew the truth. Eleanor's death had been no accident, and whoever had murdered her thought they'd gotten away with it. He would prove them wrong. Eventually. But first, he had an unexpected passenger to deal with. "Wait here," he told Morrison, striding toward the carriage. Thomas, his footman, stood frozen by the open door, clearly unsure how to proceed. Alexander waved him aside and peered into the interior. There, on the floor, partially hidden beneath the bench seat, a flash of ivory silk. A woman's foot, still clad in a delicate satin slipper. Alexander reached in and pulled back the travel blanket someone had hastily arranged as camouflage. 2 women stared up at him with identical expressions of terror. The first, a maid, judging by her dress, clutched the hand of the second woman, who was clearly no servant. Even disheveled, dusty, and trembling, she was beautiful. Dark hair tumbled from what had once been an elaborate coiffure. Her gown was exquisite despite its current state, ivory silk embroidered with seed pearls, though the lace at the hem was torn and the skirts crushed beyond repair. A wedding dress. Alexander's gaze moved to her face, pale skin, wide hazel eyes, a mouth pressed thin with fear and recognition struck him. He'd seen her portrait in the society pages. Lady Francesca Ford, the Hampshire heiress, old shipping fortune, if memory served. She'd been engaged to some merchant or other. Jenkins. Gerald Jenkins. A man Alexander had met once at his club and instinctively disliked. "Please," she whispered, and her voice trembled like a bird's wing. "Please don't send me back." Alexander studied her. The torn dress suggested flight, not leisure. The orange blossoms in her hair, wedding flowers, were wilting. Her hands, though clearly those of a gentlewoman, bore fresh scratches, as if she'd torn through brambles or climbed into this carriage in desperate haste. And her eyes. God. Her eyes held the kind of terror he'd seen in Eleanor's face the night she died. "What are you running from?" His voice came out, rougher than intended, damaged vocal cords, courtesy of smoke inhalation. She flinched at the sound, and something in Alexander's chest twisted. He'd forgotten how people reacted to him now, to the scars, the ruined voice, the spectre of the man he'd been. "My wedding," her words tumbled out in a rush. "My death, they're the same thing." Not the answer he'd expected. Alexander's mind worked quickly, cataloguing details. The wedding dress, the terror, the maid who clearly knew her well enough to flee with her. This wasn't a bride's cold feet. This was something darker. "Explain," he said. She glanced at Morrison and Thomas, both watching with undisguised curiosity. Alexander caught her meaning immediately. "Leave us," he ordered. When both men hesitated, his voice dropped to command. Now, they retreated, though not far enough for Alexander's liking. But it would have to do. Francesca drew a shaking breath. "My uncle, he arranged the marriage. I discovered this morning that Mr. Jenkins intends to commit me to an asylum after our wedding, to access my inheritance." Her hand moved to her bodice, producing a crumpled letter. "I have proof." Alexander took the paper, his scarred fingers careful not to touch hers. He read quickly, "Dr. Edmund Graves, Ashworth Asylum." The words sent ice down his spine. "After 6 months' confinement, you may dispose of her as you see fit." Dispose. He knew that word, knew what it meant when men spoke of inconvenient wives. Eleanor had discovered something 3 years ago, some financial irregularity in Alexander's late uncle's accounts. She'd told Alexander she needed more time to investigate before making accusations. 2 days later, the East Wing had caught fire while she slept. The magistrate had called it an accident, a fallen candle. But Eleanor never left candles burning. She'd been terrified of fire since childhood. Alexander had spent 3 years searching for proof of murder, 3 years watching shadows, investigating servants, questioning everyone who'd been at Ravenwood that night. And he'd found nothing concrete, nothing that would stand up in court. But he knew. Eleanor had been murdered because she'd known too much. Just as this woman would be murdered, slowly, legally, behind asylum walls, because she stood between her uncle and £50,000. "How did you know about my carriage?" he asked. "My maid saw it. In the church square. We had minutes before." Her voice broke. "I'm sorry. I know it was theft. I know you could have us arrested, but I didn't know where else to—" "Stop!" Alexander held up one scarred hand. He'd failed Eleanor, failed to see the danger until too late, failed to protect her when she'd needed him most. He wouldn't make that mistake again. "You'll come inside," he said, his voice rough but certain. "We'll talk properly. Then I'll decide what's to be done. Your Grace. Can you walk?" She nodded, though her legs shook visibly as he offered his hand. Her maid scrambled out first, then Francesca placed her small, trembling fingers in his scarred palm. The touch burned, not painfully differently, like recognition. He pulled her from the carriage, steadying her when she stumbled. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her face, the tear tracks through dust on her cheeks, the desperate hope warring with terror in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Alexander said nothing. He simply offered his arm and led her toward Ravenwood Castle's imposing doors. Behind them, the carriage stood empty. Ahead, the castle waited dark, Gothic, full of shadows. And somewhere in Hampshire, he knew, men were already searching for the bride who'd disappeared. Mrs. Blackwood had served as Ravenwood's housekeeper for 30 years. In that time, she'd witnessed births, deaths, scandals, and tragedies. But never had she seen His Grace stride through the main doors with a disheveled woman in a torn wedding dress, clinging to his arm. "Mrs. Blackwood," Alexander's voice carried the authority that brooked no questions. "This is Lady Francesca Ford. She requires a bath, food, and appropriate clothing. See to it immediately." The housekeeper's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "Your Grace, of course. This way, my lady." Francesca glanced back at Alexander as Mrs. Blackwood led her toward the east wing staircase. He nodded once, a gesture of reassurance, then turned to Morrison. "Send riders to Hampshire. Discreet inquiries about Mr. Gerald Jenkins and Lord Reginald Ford. I want to know their movements, their associates, and any whispers of scandal attached to either name." He paused. "And send someone to fetch the lady's maid from wherever she's hiding. Tell her she's safe here." Morrison's eyebrows rose. "Her maid is following on horseback, I assume. No woman flees her wedding alone without loyal help." Alexander moved toward his study. "Find her before Jenkins does." 2 hours later, Rose was discovered on the road to Kent, exhausted and terrified. By evening, she sat in Alexander's library, hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't touched, recounting the entire conspiracy. "The letter was hidden in Mr. Jenkins's chambers," she explained, her voice steadier now that she was warm and safe. "I'd gone to fetch Miss Francesca's handkerchief. She'd left it there during her last visit, and I saw papers scattered on his desk. I shouldn't have looked, but—" She swallowed hard. "Something made me look." Alexander studied the letter again, his scarred fingers tracing the words. "Dispose of her as you see fit. Clinical. Businesslike. As though Francesca were livestock, not a living woman." "Dr. Edmund Graves," he murmured. "I know that name. He testified at an asylum inquiry 5 years ago. The investigation found nothing, but rumors persisted about patients who entered his care and never left." Rose paled. "Then it's true. He would have—" "Yes," Alexander set the letter aside. "He would have killed her, eventually, after your uncle accessed the inheritance." A knock interrupted them. Francesca stood in the doorway, transformed. Mrs. Blackwood had found her a gown of deep burgundy, one of Eleanor's, Alexander realized with a sharp pang. It fit reasonably well, though Francesca was taller than his late wife had been. Her dark hair was clean now, pinned in a simple style that revealed the elegant line of her neck. She looked like herself again, except for her eyes, which still held shadows of the terror she'd escaped. "Rose," Francesca crossed to her maid, embracing her fiercely. "Thank God you're safe." "Thanks to His Grace," Rose murmured. Francesca turned to Alexander. In the library's candlelight, his scars were more visible, ridges of damaged tissue that ran from his left temple down to his jaw, disappearing beneath his collar. She didn't flinch, didn't look away, simply met his gaze directly. "Why are you helping me?" she asked quietly. "You don't know me. This isn't your concern." Alexander gestured to the chair across from his desk. Rose, understanding dismissal when she heard it, slipped from the room. When they were alone, Alexander poured 2 glasses of brandy and offered one to Francesca. She accepted without comment, another mark of her unusual character. Most well-bred ladies would refuse spirits. 3 years ago, he began, settling into his own chair, "my wife Eleanor died in a fire. The magistrate ruled it accidental. A fallen candle in the east wing." Francesca sipped her brandy, listening. Eleanor was terrified of fire, had been since childhood, when she witnessed a house burning. She would never leave a candle unattended. He paused, remembering. 2 days before the fire, she'd discovered irregularities in my late uncle's financial accounts. Nothing proven yet, but enough to make her suspicious. She told me she needed more time to investigate. "And then she died," Francesca whispered. "And then she died, conveniently, before she could expose whoever had been embezzling from the Ravenwood estate." Alexander's hand tightened on his glass. "I've spent 3 years investigating, 3 years searching for proof, and I found nothing concrete, nothing that would stand in court. But you know she was murdered." "I know." He met her gaze. "Just as I know your uncle and Mr. Jenkins intend to murder you. Legally, perhaps, hidden behind asylum walls. But murder, nonetheless." Francesca was quiet for a long moment. "I should have seen it," she said finally. "There were signs. Jenkins' eyes, they were always so cold. And Uncle Reginald's insistence that I marry quickly, that I not wait until 25, when the trust would be mine outright." She laughed bitterly. "I dismissed my own instincts, told myself I was being dramatic." "Most women are trained from birth to dismiss their instincts," Alexander said, "to trust male authority over their own judgment. It's how men like Jenkins succeed." She looked at him with something like gratitude. "You understand. I failed Eleanor because I didn't take her concerns seriously enough. I thought she was exaggerating the danger." His voice roughened. "I won't make that mistake again." The library door burst open. Morrison stood there, slightly out of breath, holding a telegram. "Your Grace, news from Hampshire." Alexander took the paper, read quickly. His jaw tightened. "What is it?" Francesca asked. "Jenkins is searching for you frantically. He's already involved magistrates, claiming you're mentally unstable, that you fled in a state of hysteria and may harm yourself." Alexander's eyes met hers. "Your uncle is offering a substantial reward for information on your whereabouts." Francesca's face drained of color. "Then I've brought danger to your door. I should leave." "And go where?" Alexander's voice was sharp. "You have no money, no legal standing. As an unmarried woman under 25, you're still under your uncle's legal authority. He can have you forcibly returned." "There must be something." "There is." Alexander set the telegram aside carefully. "Marriage ends guardianship. The moment you wed, your uncle loses all legal claim to you." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Francesca's eyes widened. "I'm not proposing," Alexander said quickly. "Not yet. I'm simply stating the legal reality. It's the only protection that would—" Morrison cleared his throat. "Your Grace, there's more." "What?" "Lord Reginald and Mr. Jenkins departed Hampshire this afternoon. They're traveling with a magistrate and 6 armed men." Morrison's face was grim. "They'll arrive at Ravenwood tomorrow morning." The brandy glass slipped from Francesca's fingers, shattering on the floor. Dawn broke over Ravenwood Castle, painting the stone walls in shades of grey and amber. Francesca hadn't slept. She'd lain in Eleanor's borrowed bed, staring at the canopy above, listening to the ancient house settle and creak around her. When she could bear it no longer, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and descended to the library. She found Alexander there, still in yesterday's clothes, papers scattered across his desk. He looked up as she entered, and she saw her own exhaustion mirrored in his eyes. "They'll be here soon," he said simply. They were. By mid-morning, the sound of horses reached the castle. Francesca stood at Alexander's study window, watching a party of riders approach through the morning mist. She recognized Uncle Reginald's grey stallion. Jenkins rode beside him on a bay mare, his posture rigid with barely contained fury. Behind them came a man in magistrate's robes, flanked by 6 armed men. Alexander appeared at her shoulder. "Stay here. This is my fight, which is why you'll stay here." His voice was gentle but firm. "Trust me." She watched him stride across the courtyard to meet them at the gates. From this distance, she couldn't hear words, only the rise and fall of voices, Uncle Reginald's imperious tone, Jenkins's clipped precision, Alexander's deeper, rougher responses. Morrison materialized beside her, his face carefully neutral. "His Grace is informing them that Lady Francesca is his guest, under his protection. And they're saying that he's harboring a fugitive, that you fled your wedding in a state of mental instability, that Mr. Jenkins, as your betrothed, has legal authority to—" Morrison stopped, uncomfortable. "To commit me to an asylum," Francesca finished. "I know." Below, Uncle Reginald's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. Jenkins remained eerily calm, but his hands clenched and unclenched on his reins. The magistrate, a thin, nervous-looking man, kept glancing between the parties as though hoping someone else would resolve this situation. Alexander's posture never wavered. He stood like the castle itself, immovable, ancient, unbreakable. Finally, he turned and walked away, leaving the men at the gates. They departed shortly after, but the threat lingered like smoke in the air. When Alexander returned to the study, his hands shook slightly as he poured brandy. Francesca noticed the tremor, this crack in his controlled facade, and something in her chest tightened. "They'll return," he said quietly, "with proper documentation, legal authority to remove you forcibly." He drank, then set the glass down with deliberate care. "There's only one way to permanently remove you from your uncle's authority." Francesca waited, though she already knew what he would say. "Marriage," Alexander continued. "Once wed, your uncle loses all legal claim. Jenkins' engagement becomes void. The inheritance would be yours, or rather, technically your husband's under English law, but that can be addressed. You're proposing. It wasn't a question. I'm presenting a solution." He finally looked at her directly, his scarred face illuminated by morning light. "A marriage of convenience. Protection, in exchange for—" He paused. "I haven't thought that far." "What do you gain from this?" Francesca asked. "You could simply hide me, send me abroad. Why marry me?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment. "For 3 years, I've existed in this castle, not living, existing, investigating Eleanor's death, avoiding society, becoming the Gothic spectre they whisper about." His fingers traced the edge of his desk. "Perhaps company, an alliance, someone who understands what it means to be hunted by those who should protect you. That's not enough reason to marry a stranger." "No," he met her gaze, "but I see in you what I couldn't save in Eleanor. She told me she was in danger, and I didn't believe her quickly enough, didn't act decisively enough." His voice roughened. "Let me save you instead. Let me be useful again." Francesca studied him, this damaged duke with his scarred face and haunted eyes, offering her salvation at the cost of his own freedom. Because marriage was a cage, wasn't it? Even marriages of convenience. "Terms," she said. Something flickered in his expression. "Relief? Respect? Separate chambers," he said immediately. "Marriage in name only, unless we both choose otherwise, at some future time. Your inheritance secured in your name through legal settlements. You'll be Duchess of Ravenwood with all attendant rights and protections, but free to live as you wish within those bounds. And if you wish to remarry, truly remarry someday, then we'll address it." He paused. "But I have no such plans. Eleanor was. She was everything. I don't expect to find that again." The honesty in his voice made Francesca's throat tighten. She thought of Jenkins's cold eyes, Uncle Reginald's calculating greed, the asylum that awaited her if she refused this offer. But more than that, she thought of Alexander's kindness yesterday, his immediate belief in her story, the way he'd understood, without explanation. "Yes," she said quietly, "I accept." The rest happened with startling speed. Alexander dispatched riders to Canterbury for a special licensed ducal authority, cutting through normal delays. By afternoon, the village priest had been summoned to Ravenwood's private chapel, a nervous man who kept glancing at Alexander's scars and Francesca's borrowed clothes. Mrs. Blackwood found a gown of blue silk, simpler than Francesca's ruined wedding dress, but elegant nonetheless. Rose pinned her hair with shaking hands, tears streaming silently down her face. "It's all right," Francesca whispered. "I'm choosing this." "I know, Miss Your Grace." Rose smiled through her tears. "I just wish it were different. You deserve romance, not refuge, perhaps." But Francesca had learned that survival mattered more than sentiment. The chapel was small, lit by afternoon sun through stained glass windows. Alexander stood at the altar in black, his face solemn. Francesca walked toward him alone, no one to give her away, no guests beyond Rose and Mrs. Blackwood as witnesses. The priest's words washed over her like water. She heard herself speak vows. She felt Alexander's scarred hand take hers as he slipped a gold ring onto her finger. Eleanor's ring, she realized with a jolt. "I pronounce you man and wife." That was it. She was married. Again. Or rather, married for the first time, since this morning's ceremony had actually concluded. That evening, Alexander escorted her to her chambers. He bowed formally at the threshold, his manner impeccably distant. "Good night, Your Grace," he said. "Francesca," she replied. "If we're married, you might as well use my name." Something softened in his expression. "Good night, Francesca." She closed the door and leaned against it, hearing his footsteps retreat down the corridor. Her wedding night, spent alone in a dead woman's room, married to a scarred stranger who'd saved her life. In the adjacent chamber, Alexander stood at his own window, staring out at the darkened grounds. Somewhere beyond those gates, Uncle Reginald and Jenkins were plotting their next move. But it was too late now. The legal documents were signed, witnessed, binding. Francesca Ford no longer existed. In her place stood the Duchess of Ravenwood, free from her uncle's guardianship, beyond Jenkins's reach, protected by one of England's oldest titles, and absolutely terrified of what came next. 1 week into marriage, Francesca had learned the rhythm of Ravenwood Castle. Breakfast at 8 in the solitary splendor of the dining room, mornings in the library, where Alexander worked on estate business while she read, luncheon, usually taken separately. Afternoons walking the grounds with Rose, dinner at 7, formal and strained, where they discussed nothing of consequence. They were painfully polite strangers who happened to share a surname. On the 8th day, Francesca found the investigation room. She'd been exploring the castle's west wing. No one had explicitly forbidden it when she discovered a locked door. The key was in the lock. Inside, she found Alexander's obsession made manifest. One entire wall was covered in notes, sketches, timelines. Eleanor's last day documented minute by minute. Lists of servants present that night, their movements, their possible motives. Financial records with certain entries circled in red ink. Newspaper clippings about the fire, about Eleanor's death, about Alexander's subsequent withdrawal from society. 3 years of investigation, covering every surface. "I should have locked that properly." Francesca spun. Alexander stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to—" "No." He entered, closing the door behind him. "You're my wife. You have a right to know what drives me." He gestured at the wall. "This is what I couldn't tell you before we married, that I'm half mad with it. That I can't let her death go unavenged." Francesca studied the meticulous documentation. "You're not mad. You're right. Someone murdered her, and they've escaped justice." Something in his face shifted. "You believe me?" "Of course I believe you." She turned to face him fully. "I know what it's like when everyone else thinks you're imagining danger. When they dismiss your instincts, because it's inconvenient to believe you." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then, Alexander cleared his throat. "Dinner," he said. "Mrs. Blackwood will have prepared something." The dining room was lit by candles, the table set with silver and crystal. Mrs. Blackwood had outdone herself: roasted pheasant, glazed vegetables, fresh bread, and wine, ruby red in cut glass decanters. Alexander poured for both of them, then paused. Francesca watched, confused, as he lifted her glass to his nose, inhaling deeply. His expression darkened. "Don't drink this." "What?" He was already moving, calling for Morrison, his voice sharp with command. Within minutes, the household physician had been summoned. Dr. Garrett, a serious man who'd served the Thorne family for decades. "Laudanum," Dr. Garrett confirmed after testing the wine. "Substantial amount, enough to cause severe illness, possibly death depending on the lady's constitution." The room spun. Francesca gripped the table edge, feeling bile rise in her throat. Someone had tried to poison her. In Alexander's own home. At his own table. Who had access to this wine? Alexander's voice was deadly quiet. Mrs. Blackwood looked stricken. The footman, Your Grace. Thomas, no, not Thomas. The new one, Peters. He was assigned to the dining room this week. Fetch him, now. But Peters was gone. His quarters were empty, his few possessions vanished. On his pillow lay a single note, written in crude script. Jenkins sends regards. Alexander crumpled the paper in his scarred fist. Francesca had never seen him truly angry before. His fury was cold, controlled, absolutely terrifying. How was he hired? Alexander demanded. Morrison consulted his records, face pale. Recommendation came 3 weeks ago, Your Grace, from a gentleman in Hampshire. I verified the reference, it seemed legitimate. Before or after I brought Francesca here? Before, Your Grace, but only just. Jenkins was planning this. Francesca's voice shook. Even before I fled, he was positioning someone inside Ravenwood, in case I managed to escape to you. The realization was chilling. Jenkins had anticipated her every move, planned for every contingency. How much money was he willing to spend? How many people had he bribed? How far would he go? The next hours passed in a blur. Alexander interrogated every servant, had the wine cellar inspected, every entrance to the castle secured. He moved through Ravenwood like an avenging angel, his controlled rage more frightening than any display of temper. Francesca was ordered to her chambers. Dr. Garrett insisted she rest, though she'd drunk nothing. Shock, he said. The body's response to near death. She lay in Eleanor's bed, no, her bed now staring at the canopy, trembling. Jenkins had reached her even here, in a Duke's stronghold. Nowhere was safe. Nowhere. She must have dozed, because she woke in darkness to find Alexander sitting in the chair beside her bed. What are you doing? She whispered. Ensuring you're alive. His voice was rough. I can't. I won't lose someone else to poison. Eleanor was poisoned first. The fire was meant to hide the evidence. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, face in his hands. I should have protected her better, should have believed her sooner. And now you... Francesca reached out before she could think better of it, her fingers finding his scarred hand. He flinched at the contact, but didn't pull away. You saved me, she said quietly. You smelled the laudanum. If you hadn't been cautious, if you hadn't tested the wine, I thought I'd lost you. The words burst from him, raw and unguarded. For one moment, seeing that wine, I thought he'd succeeded, that I'd failed again. But you didn't fail. I'm alive because of you. His hand turned in hers, scarred fingers intertwining with smooth ones. They sat like that in the darkness, connected by touch and terror, and something else neither was ready to name. Alexander leaned closer. Francesca's breath caught. His scarred face was inches from hers, his eyes dark with emotion she couldn't decipher. Her heart hammered as he raised his free hand toward her face. A knock shattered the moment. They sprang apart as Rose entered with a tea tray, her eyes widening at the scene. I'm sorry. Stay, Francesca said, her voice unsteady. Please. Rose set down the tray, glancing between them. Your Grace, I need to show you something. Both of you. What she produced was a leather folio, stuffed with papers. I've been documenting everything, Rose explained. Every letter between Mr. Jenkins and Lord Reginald that I could copy. Every conversation I overheard. Financial records from your uncle's study. I knew we'd need proof eventually. Alexander took the folio, leafing through with increasing intensity. Rose, this is extraordinary. Bank transfers, correspondence with Dr. Graves, even a draft of the committal papers they plan to file. He looked up. You're a natural investigator. Rose flushed. I just knew Miss Francesca. Her Grace would need ammunition someday. We need more than defense, Alexander said, standing. We need to attack. Jenkins won't stop. There's too much money at stake. £50,000 can buy a lot of assassins. What are you proposing? Francesca asked. We investigate Jenkins, his past, his first wife's death, his financial dealings. We find evidence of his crimes, and we destroy him publicly. Alexander's scarred face was fierce in the candlelight. He wants to play hunter? I'll show him what it means to be hunted by a thorn. Francesca stood as well, steadier now. Then we start tomorrow. We start tonight. Alexander turned to Morrison, who'd appeared in the doorway. Send for my investigators. Every man I used to search for Eleanor's killer. And double the castle guard. He looked at Francesca, his expression softening slightly. He won't get another chance, Alexander vowed. I'll destroy him first. 3 weeks later, Ravenwood Castle had transformed into the headquarters of a war campaign. Alexander's investigators arrived daily with reports, documents, testimony. The investigation room expanded to consume an entire wing, its walls now covered with evidence of Jenkins's crimes spanning years. Francesca had become Alexander's partner in truth, not just in name. She helped organize documents, interviewed witnesses, traced financial connections with the sharp intelligence that had once been wasted on needlework and deportment lessons. The picture that emerged was monstrous. "Your Grace." Morrison appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Mr. Thornbury has returned from London. He says it's urgent." Thomas Thornbury was Alexander's most skilled investigator, a former Bow Street runner, with connections throughout England's criminal underworld. He entered carrying a leather satchel stuffed with papers. "I found her," he said without preamble. "Jenkins's previous fiancée, Miss Catherine Ashford, daughter of a textile merchant, engaged to Jenkins in 1824, worth £35,000. Francesca's stomach clenched. What happened to her? Committed to Blackwood Asylum 3 months after their wedding. Died there 6 months later. Thornbury produced a death certificate. Official cause, brain fever brought on by hysteria. "The same pattern," Alexander said quietly. "Identical, Your Grace. But here's what's interesting. I bribed the asylum clerk. Got access to Miss Ashford's medical records. He laid out papers covered in physician's handwriting. She was perfectly healthy when committed. No signs of mental instability. The admitting physician was Dr. Cornelius Blackwood. The asylum director," Francesca breathed, "Dr. Graves's superior, and Jenkins's business associate." Thornbury produced bank statements. Jenkins paid Blackwood £5,000 the month Catherine Ashford died. Exactly the same amount mentioned in the letter Rose intercepted. The room fell silent. Francesca felt sick. Catherine Ashford, a woman she'd never met, dead 3 years, could have been her. Would have been her, if not for Rose's intervention. "There's more," Thornbury continued. "I investigated the fire at Ravenwood. Your Grace, Jenkins wasn't just connected to it, he orchestrated it." Alexander went very still. "Explain." "The man who set the fire, Marcus Donnelly, deceased in a tavern brawl 6 months later, was Jenkins's business partner in a shipping venture. They'd insured cargo heavily, then arranged for ships to accidentally sink. Insurance fraud. When the scheme was discovered, Donnelly needed to disappear." Thornbury hesitated. "Jenkins paid him to start the fire. The plan was to make it look like an accident, collect the insurance on Ravenwood's East Wing. Eleanor's death was collateral damage," Alexander said, his voice hollow. "I'm sorry, Your Grace." "Yes." Thornbury produced more documents, but it was profitable collateral. Jenkins collected £10,000 in commission from the insurance scheme. He profited from Lady Eleanor's murder. Alexander stood abruptly, his chair crashing backward. Without a word, he strode from the room. Francesca found him an hour later in the investigation room, standing before the wall dedicated to Eleanor's death. His hands trembled against the desk, scarred knuckles white with tension. 3 years, he said without turning. 3 years I've searched for her killer, and all this time it was him, Jenkins. He murdered my wife for £10,000. Alexander, I couldn't save her. His voice broke. I was sleeping in the West Wing. I didn't even know the fire had started until the servants woke me. By then, she was already. He stopped, shoulders shaking. Francesca crossed to him, placing her hands on his back. She felt him stiffen, then collapse inward, grief pouring out of him in great, wrenching sobs. She held him while he broke, while 3 years of controlled fury and carefully contained sorrow finally shattered. I couldn't save her, he repeated against her shoulder. But I can save you. I will save you. Francesca pulled back enough to see his face scarred, tear-streaked, beautiful in its anguish. You already have, she whispered. Every day I'm here, I'm alive because of you. Their eyes met. Something shifted in the air between them, grief transforming into desperate need. Alexander's hand came up to cup her face, scarred fingers gentle against her cheek. Francesca, she kissed him, claimed him, poured 3 weeks of longing and terror and gratitude into the press of her lips against his. He responded with equal desperation, pulling her closer, kissing her like she was air and he was drowning. His scars were rough beneath her fingers, his body solid and warm and alive. They were both alive, despite everything, and that felt like victory enough. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "I don't want separate chambers anymore," Francesca said. That night, she went to him. The Duke's chamber was larger than hers, dominated by a massive 4-poster bed. Alexander stood by the window, still dressed, clearly not expecting her. "Francesca, I'm your wife," she said quietly. "Not in name only, not anymore. If you want me." "If I want you?" His laugh was incredulous. "God, Francesca, I've wanted you since I pulled you from that carriage, but I didn't want to pressure you, didn't want you to feel obligated." She kissed him again, softer this time. "I'm not obligated. I'm choosing this. Choosing you." What followed was tender and passionate and real, the true consummation of vows they'd spoken in awkward formality 3 weeks ago. Alexander was careful with her, reverent, as though she might shatter. She showed him with hands and lips and whispered words that she was stronger than he feared. Afterward, they lay tangled together, her head on his scarred chest, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "What happens now?" she murmured. "Now we destroy him." Alexander's voice was steady, determined. "We have enough evidence to bring criminal charges. Jenkins will face trial for fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and attempted murder." Morning brought awkward sweetness, uncertain smiles, touches that were both familiar and new. They dressed together, a intimacy Francesca had never imagined wanting. Alexander helped with her stays, his scarred fingers surprisingly deft. She tied his cravat, standing close enough to feel his heartbeat. They were partners now, in every sense. The solicitor arrived before noon, reviewing Thornbury's evidence with growing excitement. "Your Grace, this is extraordinary. We can prosecute. Not just defend against his claims, but actually see him hanged." He paused. "Rose's testimony will be crucial. Can she withstand cross-examination?" "She's stronger than she looks," Francesca said. "Then we proceed." The solicitor gathered his papers. "I'll file charges this week." Morrison appeared in the doorway, his face grave. "Your Grace." A letter arrived by special courier, from Jenkins's solicitor. Alexander opened it, read, then passed it to Francesca without comment. "Mr. Gerald Jenkins requests formal hearing before ecclesiastical court. Claims marriage between Lady Francesca Ford and Alexander Thorne, Duke of Ravenwood, was coerced under duress. Seeks annulment on grounds of force and fraud." "He's desperate," Alexander said, "attacking the marriage itself. Can he succeed?" "Not with the evidence we have." But Alexander's jaw was tight. "Though it means facing him in court, facing them both, Jenkins and your uncle." Francesca took his scarred hand in hers. "Then we face them together." 2 weeks before the trial, Francesca woke to the smell of smoke. For one confused moment, she thought she was dreaming. Then her eyes opened to darkness thick with grey haze, and terror slammed through her. Fire. She stumbled from bed, lungs already burning. The door, she grabbed the handle and pulled. Nothing. She tried again, panic rising. The door was jammed from the outside. "Alexander!" Her scream tore at her throat. "Alexander!" Smoke billowed under the door, growing thicker by the second. Francesca fell to her knees, crawling toward the window. The East Wing. Just like Eleanor, history repeating itself with ruthless precision. She reached the window, gasping for air that wasn't there. Her vision blurred. The room spun. Distantly, she heard shouting, footsteps, Alexander's voice roaring her name. Then darkness. Alexander had been sleeping peacefully, truly peacefully, for the first time in 3 years, when the smell of smoke jerked him awake. No, not again. Not her. He was running before conscious thought caught up, barefoot and shirtless, terror making him faster than he'd ever moved. Francesca's chamber. The hallway was already filling with smoke. Servants were shouting, forming bucket lines, but Alexander only had eyes for one door. Locked. Jammed. He threw his shoulder against it once, twice, feeling wood splinter but not give. The old scars on his face and chest screamed with remembered agony. The East Wing. Eleanor's screams, flames everywhere. He kicked. The door frame cracked. One more kick, and it burst inward. Smoke billowed out, choking him. Francesca! He couldn't see, couldn't breathe. His hands found her by the window, collapsed against the wall, unconscious. Alexander gathered her into his arms, turning back toward the hallway. Flames had spread, licking up the walls, consuming tapestries and wooden panels with terrifying speed. The path they'd need was blocked. The window. No choice. He carried Francesca to the balcony, smoke searing his lungs. Below, servants had assembled with ladders, shouting instructions he couldn't hear over the roar of flames. His arms burned where sparks had caught his skin, fresh wounds layering over old scars. "Take her," he lowered Francesca over the balcony edge, as carefully as he could manage. Hands reached up, guiding her down the ladder. Only when she was safe did Alexander follow, his burned arms screaming protest with every movement. The castle staff fought through the night. By dawn, they'd saved most of Ravenwood, though the east wing was gutted once more, a charred skeleton against the morning sky. Dr. Garrett treated them both in Alexander's study. Francesca's lungs were damaged from smoke inhalation. Alexander had fresh burns up both arms and across his back, places where embers had caught his bare skin. "You could have died," Francesca whispered, her voice raw. "You ran into fire for me." Alexander's laugh was bitter. "Did you think I wouldn't? Francesca, watching you smile at breakfast is the only thing that makes me want to face each day. Of course I ran into fire for you." She started crying, then great, heaving sobs that made her damaged lungs ache. Alexander pulled her against his chest, ignoring the pain from his burns, and held her while she shattered. "I saw him, Your Grace." Rose stood in the doorway, soot-streaked and furious. In her hands, she held a charred piece of cloth bearing a distinctive crest. "The footman who fled Peters. He came back. I saw him in the east wing, just before the fire started." Her voice shook with rage. "He didn't see me, but I saw him. And I found this near the accelerant point. The crest belonged to Jenkins' household. He tried to kill us both," Francesca said. "Eliminate the witnesses before trial. He failed." Alexander's voice was deadly quiet. "And now we have attempted murder to add to the charges. 1 week to recover. 7 days of tender care and mounting fury and preparation for the battle ahead." They traveled to London in Alexander's carriage, Francesca still weak, Alexander's arms wrapped in bandages beneath his coat. The royal courts of justice loomed before them, Gothic architecture that matched their story, all stone and shadows and the promise of judgment. The courtroom was packed. Every scandal-monger in London had come to witness the Duke of Ravenwood's fight against the man who'd tried to murder his wife. Jenkins sat with his solicitor, his face a mask of false composure. Beside him, Uncle Reginald looked purple with rage and fear. Alexander's legal team was led by Sir Edmund Hartley, the finest barrister in England. He rose, and the courtroom fell silent. "My lords, we will demonstrate that Mr. Gerald Jenkins engaged in a systematic conspiracy to defraud and murder Lady Francesca Thorne, Duchess of Ravenwood. Furthermore, we will prove his connection to the death of Eleanor Thorne, late Duchess of Ravenwood, killed in 1824. What followed was a masterclass in legal destruction. First, the financial records. £8,000 in payments from Jenkins to Lord Reginald, documented in Rose's meticulous copies. Uncle Reginald's face drained of colour as his gambling debts were exposed, his embezzlement from Francesca's trust revealed. Then, Dr. Cornelius Blackwood, brought in shackles to testify. The asylum director broke under questioning, admitting to decades of false commitments for profit. His records showed Catherine Ashford Jenkins's previous fiancée had been healthy when admitted, then systematically starved and drugged until her death. "How much did Mr. Jenkins pay you?" Sir Edmund asked. £5,000, Blackwood whispered. "For Catherine. Another 5,000 was promised for the next one." The courtroom erupted. The judge's gavel cracked like thunder. Rose testified next, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. She presented every letter, every overheard conversation, every piece of damning evidence she'd collected, the forged medical assessments Jenkins had prepared before the wedding, the correspondence with Dr. Graves about disposal methods. Then Francesca took the stand. She was pale, her voice still rough from smoke damage, but she spoke clearly, telling her story with devastating composure. The drowning of her parents, Uncle Reginald's cold guardianship, Jenkins's dead eyes. The morning she discovered the truth and fled for her life. "He didn't want me," she said quietly. "He wanted my inheritance, And when I became inconvenient, he tried to burn me alive in my bed. Jenkins's solicitor tried to interrupt, but Sir Edmund produced evidence of Peters's employment, the accelerant used, the jammed door, attempted murder, premeditated and brutal. Finally, Alexander testified about Eleanor. The courtroom fell absolutely silent as he described the fire 3 years ago, his wife's death, his long investigation, the connection to Jenkins's insurance fraud scheme. Marcus Donnelly, Jenkins's partner, paid to start the blaze. My wife discovered their fraud, Alexander said, his scarred face terrible in its control. 2 days later, she was dead. Jenkins profited £10,000 from her murder. Uncle Reginald had an apoplectic fit when the judge called for his arrest. He clutched his chest, face purple, raging about conspiracies and lies. No one moved to help him. Jenkins attempted to flee. He made it 3 steps before bailiffs restrained him, dragging him back as he screamed about his rights, his innocence, the unfairness of it all. The judge's ruling was swift and merciless. The marriage between Alexander Thorne, Duke of Ravenwood, and Lady Francesca Ford is valid and binding. Mr. Gerald Jenkins is remanded to custody, charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and murder. Lord Reginald Ford is stripped of all authority and will face separate criminal proceedings. He looked directly at Francesca. Your Grace, your inheritance is secured completely in your name, free from any guardianship or constraint. The gavel fell. It was over. They exited the courthouse to a cheering crowd. News had spread through London, the dramatic rescue, the evil conspiracy, the Duke who'd saved his bride from fire and corruption. People lined the streets, calling blessings, throwing flowers. Francesca leaned against Alexander, exhausted and triumphant. His bandaged arms circled her waist, holding her steady. We won, she whispered. We survived, he corrected. Together. 6 weeks after the trial, Francesca stood before her mirror, smoothing the silk of her gown with trembling hands. The burns on Alexander's arms had faded to pink scars layered over old white ones. Her lungs no longer ached with every breath. They were healing, both of them, but some wounds ran deeper than flesh. You don't have to do this, Alexander said from the doorway. We can send regrets to the Duchess of Marlborough. No, Francesca turned to face him. I'm tired of hiding, tired of letting fear dictate my choices. He crossed to her, devastatingly handsome in formal black. 3 years of exile had ended. Tonight they were attending the season opening ball together, facing society as Duke and Duchess of Ravenwood. The ballroom was ablaze with candlelight and jewels. Every gossip monger in London had come to witness the scandalous couple's first public appearance. Francesca felt their stares like physical touches, curious, judgmental, hungry for fresh drama. Alexander's hand tightened on hers. Steady, he murmured. They can't touch you. Not anymore. They should have found a quiet corner, made polite conversation, gradually eased back into society. Instead, Alexander led her directly to the center of the dance floor. The orchestra fell silent. Hundreds of eyes turned toward them. Francesca's heart hammered against her stays. Alexander released her hand and turned to address the room, his scarred face proud and unapologetic. I have spent 3 years hiding, he announced, his damaged voice carrying perfectly in the sudden stillness. From society, from life, from happiness, I became a ghost, haunting my own castle, convinced I deserved nothing more. Whispers rippled through the crowd. The Duchess of Marlborough looked torn between scandal and delight. Then this extraordinary woman sought refuge in my carriage, Alexander continued, turning to Francesca. She was fleeing a wedding that would have killed her. And in saving her, she saved me. Francesca's eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. You gave me back my life, Francesca. His voice softened, intimate despite their audience. Let me give you something in return, a future without fear, without shame, without anything but absolute devotion. He kissed her, deeply, scandalously, in the center of the Duchess of Marlborough's ballroom while society watched in shock. For one endless moment, silence reigned. Then, someone started clapping, the Duchess of Marlborough herself, laughing with delight. Others joined until the entire ballroom erupted in applause. The orchestra struck up a waltz. Alexander swept Francesca into his arms, and they danced, while hundreds watched the scarred Duke and his rescued Duchess, claiming their place in society without apology. That was insane, Francesca whispered, breathless. That was necessary. Alexander smiled, and it transformed his scarred face into something beautiful. No more hiding, not for either of us. 3 months later, Francesca woke feeling ill. By afternoon, the physician had confirmed what she'd suspected. She was with child. Alexander's reaction was everything she could have hoped. Joy, terror, fierce protectiveness. He immediately ordered renovations to the nursery, interviewed wet nurses, drove everyone half mad with his preparations. News arrived that same week. Jenkins had died in Newgate Prison, officially ghoul fever, but whispers suggested his criminal partners had silenced him before he could implicate others. Francesca felt nothing at the news, no satisfaction, no grief. Jenkins had become irrelevant the moment the judge's gavel fell. Uncle Reginald lived in disgrace in Cornwall, his estate seized to pay creditors. Francesca had no contact with him. Some wounds didn't merit healing. Rose became head housekeeper at Ravenwood and godmother-to-be, her loyalty rewarded with position and security. She'd found her own purpose, managing the castle with quiet efficiency while documenting everything for the book she planned to write. 8 months after the trial, Francesca stood in the newly completed nursery, watching her husband hold their daughter. Eleanor Catherine Thorne had arrived during a spring storm, screaming her fury at the world. She had Alexander's dark hair and Francesca's hazel eyes, and she'd wrapped them both around her tiny finger within moments. Alexander sang softly, a lullaby his own mother had taught him. His scarred hands cradled their daughter with infinite gentleness. The burns from the fire had healed into new scars, but he wore them differently now, not as marks of tragedy, but as testimony to survival. "She's asleep," Francesca whispered. "I don't want to put her down yet." Alexander looked up, his face transformed by wonder. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and discover this was a dream." "It's real." Francesca crossed to them, resting her hand on his shoulder. "We're real." Rose appeared in the doorway, smiling. "Tea in the drawing room, your graces, when you're ready." They eventually settled Eleanor in her cradle and descended together, Alexander's arm around Francesca's waist. In the drawing room, newspapers were stacked on the table, reports of the parliamentary inquiry Francesca had funded into private asylums. Dr. Blackwood's trial had exposed systemic corruption. Reforms were being debated. Women were being freed from false imprisonment. Catherine Ashford's death wouldn't be meaningless. Eleanor's murder wouldn't go unmarked. Francesca had transformed her pain into purpose. That evening, they walked the castle grounds together, Eleanor sleeping against Alexander's chest in a sling Rose had fashioned. They passed the carriage house, and Francesca paused, studying the elegant black vehicle with its silver raven crest. "That carriage saved my life," she said quietly. "You saved your own life." Alexander shifted Eleanor gently. "You chose to run, chose to trust me, chose to fight rather than surrender. We saved each other." Francesca leaned against him, careful not to disturb their sleeping daughter. "I fled toward the unknown and found everything I'd never dared to hope for." Alexander kissed the top of her head. "Sometimes the most dangerous journey leads to the safest harbor." They stood there as twilight deepened, watching bats swoop through the gathering darkness. Ravenwood Castle rose behind them, no longer a Gothic prison, but a home filled with laughter and purpose and fierce love. Francesca had been taught from birth that a woman's role was to be decorative, obedient, convenient. She'd learned instead that a woman could be brave, strategic, powerful. That survival sometimes demanded you trust a stranger more than the family who raised you. That love could grow from necessity into something transcendent. The carriage stood silent in its house, waiting for the next journey. But Francesca's running days were over. She'd fled from captivity and found freedom, fled from death and found life, fled from a loveless marriage and found a partnership that transformed them both. Sometimes, when you run from the life others designed for you, you discover the life you were always meant to have. And sometimes, rarely, miraculously, you find it in the most unexpected places, in a scarred duke's carriage, in his wounded heart, in the fierce determination to survive against impossible odds. Francesca had sought refuge and found a home, had sought safety and found purpose, had sought escape and found, instead, everything.